Now I will put forward certain questions which suggest some of the major issues in the field of post-colonial literary theory. Like, how did the experience of colonization affect those who were colonized, and vice versa? How were the colonizers affected? How were colonial powers able to gain control over so large a portion of the non-Western world? What traces have been left by colonial education? What traces have been left by colonial science, by colonial technology in post-colonial societies? Is there any impact of the colonial education on the colonized societies? How do these traces affect decisions about development and modernization in the post-colonies? What were the forms of resistance against colonial control? How did colonial education and colonial language influence the culture and identity of the colonized societies, of the colonized people, of the colonized countries? And how did the technology, the medicine change existing knowledge system of the colonized societies? What are the emergent forms of post-colonial identity after the departure of the colonizers? And to what extent has decolonization, a reconstruction free from colonial influence, been possible? Should decolonization proceed through an aggressive return to the pre-colonial past? There is a tendency towards essentialism these days in the previously colonized societies. How do gender, how do race, how do class function in colonial and post-colonial discourse? Are new forms of imperialism replacing colonization? And if yes, how? Like we see cultural colonization, market colonization. This is going on. So along with these questions, there are some more that are particularly pertinent to post-colonial literature. Should the writer use a colonial language to reach a wider audience, or return to a native language more relevant to the groups in the post-colony? Which writers should be included in the post-colonial canon? How can texts in translation from non-colonial languages enrich our understanding of post-colonial issues? And how should post-colonial literature be approached in a way that honors its aesthetic dimensions? These are certain questions which should be asked while discussing post-colonial literature. Once former masters left, new independent countries had to deal not only with many economic and social issues such as poverty, such as lack of education, or the medium of education, no, but also with the aftermath of colonialism. There are many other aspects also. Centuries of maltreatment, complete disrespect and negation of the natives' values, and cultural alienation, the subjugated people from their own lands, and brought an erosion of their identity. Beliefs established by colonizers that indigenous people were savages, were uncivilized, and that their culture was less important, the colonized people's culture was less important, have proved to be wrong. The post-colonial authors' challenge was to find and re-establish their lost national identity, their lost national history, their lost national literature, and to define their relationship with the land and language of their former masters. Post-colonial theory takes many different shapes and interventions, but all share a fundamental claim. What? That the world we inhabit can be understood in relation to the history of imperialism and colonial rule. We cannot ignore that period. We cannot ignore the colonial period, even if we want to understand our nation. This means that it is impossible to conceive of European philosophy, European literature, or European history as existing in the absence of Europe's colonial encounter and operations around the world. In the same manner, we cannot understand the culture of the colonized people, the civilization of the colonized people, without taking into account the period when they were colonized. It also suggests that the colonized world stands at the forgotten center of global modernity. The prefix post of post-colonial theory has been rigorously debated, but it has never implied that colonialism has ended. Indeed, much of post-colonial theory is concerned with the lingering forms of colonial authority after the formal end of the empire. Now again, I will talk about the main characteristics of post-colonial literature. Interacting with the traditional colonial discourse, critical look at imperialism and its legacy. That means looking at the pros and cons of the colonial rule, reclaiming the past, searching for cultural and personal identity. Personal identity means the identity of a nation, of a civilization. In other words, post-colonial critics give importance to the questions of cultural differences and diversity and examine their treatment in relative literary works. They ascertain the emergent forms of post-colonial identity after the departure of the colonizers, and identify the forms of resistance against colonial control. And they discuss the resistance movement, whether the means were also proper. Determine the influence of colonial education. Determine the influence of colonial language or the culture and identity of the colonized, and examine the feasibility of the decolonizing of the minds. Post-colonial criticism has embraced a number of aims, most fundamentally to re-examine the history of colonialism from the perspective of the colonized, as I said in the very beginning of this lecture, to determine the economic, to determine the political, to determine the cultural impact of colonialism on both the colonized people and the colonizing powers, and to analyze the process of decolonization. Some early voices of anti-imperialism stressed the need to develop or to return to the indigenous literary traditions. Other voices advocated an adaptation of Western ideals towards their own political and cultural ends. They were not very critical to the Western ideals. They believed that when two cultures come in contact with each other, something new